It would be unfair to say that I had grown to loathe collecting humans. It was just that collecting them had grown incredibly time-consuming over the years. They had developed infuriating machines they wore under the surface of their skin that made their hearts keep beating. Mechanical checks and valves, they had learned to insidiously utilize light itself as an avenue of surgery and healing. They cut into their own bodies, a feat I had scoffed at along with their best and brightest in the early days of their medicine, and then put them back together. And then I would slot some time into my schedule, as even death must keep time, and try to act as a conscientious ferryman. Time didn't mean much in the void, but when I was actively engaged in a job I was in real space, and that consumed time that I didn't have. I could collect a dozen of many other species in the time it took to collect a single ornery human. I'd show up to a car crash, or a fire, or a shooting, thinking that I could be in and out relatively quickly. And sometimes I would be. For all their strength, human bodies still have a termination point. A point where frailty overcomes perseverance. But time and again I'd show up to what I thought was a sure thing and be rebuffed. I had been denied before, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't up until those cursed computers got involved that I could be completely shut out. Life support. What kind of ridiculous notion is that? I could find myself waiting for days to collect souls that once would have been a simple grocery run. More and more I was showing up, getting flipped off, and may I take a moment to point out how incredibly unprofessional that is, and not getting the chance to collect for decades. Fortunately I was still able to keep busy. For all their advancement in the realm of keeping themselves alive, they were still equally adept at killing themselves. And each other. Don't get me wrong, I was keeping busy. In fact, it wasn't until the late 25th century, if one goes by the human reckoning, that I caught up with the backlog and realized I didn't have nearly as many names on my register as I should have. I chalked it up to the increased human lifespan and a distinct lack of warring. I was back to the sort of workload I had shouldered in the early days of taking on this gig. Back before humans had popped up on my radar. I thought it curious, but I had never been one to deny fate. I left that to the humans in my charge. But then a curious thing happened. An entire day with no real work. Some small things, yes. Some other more easily collectible creatures, but no humans. Now, as I'm sure you can understand, I found this somewhat alarming. I am a being of singular purpose who hasn't taken a day off in, well, pretty much for as long as the concept of time has existed to the human race. I could go fishing, I supposed. Do a little light reading. It's not that I don't know how to have fun, I'd been watching humans kill themselves with it for a very long time. The real problem is having too many options. I suppose I got lulled into it. One day with no human deaths every once in a while was actually kind of nice, considering the pain that humans had been pretty much every time I had collected one. Actually got a chance to do some sightseeing in real space, not something I had ever been able to do before. Somehow one day with no deaths became 2 without my notice. Then 3. It's important to understand, of course, that humans weren't my only charge. Death is a universal constant. Universal. As in everywhere. It was just that humans were the only ones who consumed any significant portion of my time. I was still working. It wasn't like I just stopped coming into the office. It wasn't until I was out quite some way from human space, admiring the cooling remains of a dying planet, not my work, I have to give the accolades to time for that I got my first actual notice in some time. A human was dying. Just one. A human was dying. Just one. Startled from my reverie, I did some quick calculations. If I'd had a stomach it would have dropped. This was the first human death in quite some time. I folded my cloak around me, collapsing into the void, resurfacing across space and time in an instant at the sight of my newest charge. There was a flash of light and the electronic hum of the humans' thrice damned machines. In that instant I felt an odd gripping sensation. As though 1,000 tiny little human hands had grabbed hold of every bone and held me in place. Concerned, I swirled my cloak about me, collapsing back into the stasis field, stable and holding. We're detecting a disturbance but aren't picking up anything on camera. Mr. Roman, have you established visual contact? I whirled about, eyeing the speakers on the walls from which the voice had issued. Stark white walls. No doors. No windows. A handful of cameras dotted a handful of scattered surfaces. A completely enclosed space on every side and every angle. A trap. Not the first attempt that a human had ever made. First time it had ever succeeded though. Yes I have, Mr. Fields. Yes I have. Momentarily resigned I turned to examine my cellmate. An unremarkable human being, by any standard. Hospital bed. Older male. Caucasian. Lined hands, weathered skin, faded eyes, all the telltale signs of a human being dying of an age-related illness. Just worn out. Finished, the gears no longer able to keep him running anymore. The same fate of which their machines they loved so much so often suffered. But his eyes. For all that they were faded, for all of the years that they had seen, they were locked onto my empty orbs like only a handful of humans before. I sighed. Are you going to make this a fight? I asked. He shook his head. Me. I'm a tired old man. I've resigned myself to it. I laughed. You know, I have been waiting a very long time to hear that. But it's not really me who's making you stay here, is it? We are very glad you could join us, Mr. Death. Ah. Yes. They can't hear me or see me. I explained softly, soothingly, to Mr. Roman. I'm only here for you. Actually they can. Indeed we can, Mr. Death. The voice intoned. Mr. Roman has graciously allowed us the use of his sensory proprioceptors for this meeting. Mr. Roman tapped his temple. They see what I see and hear what I hear, without any mumbo-jumbo getting in the middle. There, now, was that glint of steel in his weathered eyes. That eminently human gaze. With a bit of a struggle he rose to a sitting position in his bed. Didn't want anything getting lost in translation. Mr. Roman has graciously agreed to act as a sort of ambassador in this matter, Mr. Death. The voice stated, matter-of-factly. I'm certain that by this point you've noticed that your workload has lightened somewhat. It's just death, actually. I said, starting to stalk the corners of the room. I was aware that it was something I was often accused of doing. A stereotype that ironically refused to die and was loath to actually be observed doing it. But I had a desperate feeling that escape was the prudent course. And I have noticed a certain lightening over the last few thousand years, if I was to be honest. Yes, normally I would apologize for damaging somebody's bottom line like that. But given the situation, I'm sure you can understand why any apology wouldn't be sincere. Of course. I said absently, tapping experimentally at the cameras with my scythe. Your species and I have always had a somewhat adversarial working relationship. I gave up on the cameras, it wasn't like they could see me anyway. I was more unnerved by the steel blue eyes of the man in the bed as they tracked me around the room. He watched me with an unwavering dedication. Unflinching, unblinking, and until I was allowed to leave this room, technically undying. I'm sure we could discuss this at length if you want when I come back to collect you. Well, Mr. Death, that's kind of the purpose behind this meeting. You see your services are no longer required. I stopped cold. Distantly in my memory I recalled the first human I had ever pulled screaming into the void. There's always a way, he had said. I had thought it folly, then. I was a fundamental truth of the universe. As inescapable as time itself. You're bluffing. I said. Mr. Roman chuckled. A dry and unpleasant sound. Then leave. He countered. I sighed again. So I'm to be a prisoner then? I stated. It was not a question. I knew humans better than they could have ever known themselves. They thrived on vengeance. In their eyes I was a murderer beyond comprehension. You know you can't keep me. You cannot comprehend the immeasurable damage being done every second I'm here. The laughter was unexpected. Did you know, Mr. Death, that if one was to drop a wine glass and observe the way in which it shattered, plot the trajectory of its component parts, that there is no mathematical reason why that same glass should not be able to pull itself together? I assumed the question was rhetorical and was proven correct when the voice went on. The reason why it didn't see that was something that bothered us for a very long time. Eventually we settled on the cause. The fixed flow of time. The movement of things toward some future point. We named it entropy. You are familiar with the concept of entropy, I assume. With a sinking feeling I waved my hand toward the lens of a camera nestled into the wall. I was dismayed, although not altogether surprised, when it failed to decay to dust. If one can remove time from the equation, they can remove entropy. If one can remove entropy, well, you've pretty much pulled all of death's teeth right out of its head. His head. Your head. I knew that they would never explain themselves to me, although I had experienced similar effects while in close proximity to the gravity wells of black holes, in places where time slowed to a crawl. I could only imagine these humans were utilizing some similar trick, exacerbated by their electronic machines, to slow death and decay to the point of non-existence. I wondered at the passage of time in this place. Here were humans, playing with it like so much putty. It was a force that demanded respect. But then so had I, once. What is it that you want? Access to the void. You won't find your friends or family there. I have told countless others of your kind, there's no paradise there. There's nothing. And that makes getting around very efficient, I would imagine. My jaw hit the floor. I mean that in the literal sense. I collected it as I scrambled to comprehend the possible ramifications of the request. Unlimited access to the void. For the purpose of day-to-day travel. It was impossible. It was unconscionable. What else? I asked. At this time there is nothing else you have that we wish to acquire. I considered as I watched Mr. Roman. His skin had grown paler as the voice had spoken. His breathing slowed. This was a man not long for the world. Tell me, Mr. Roman. I spoke conversationally as I approached the bed, pulling up the single chair that sat beside it and sinking down. How is it that the human race feels that they have moved beyond death when you so clearly are waiting to embrace it? He laughed at me again, as dry and uncomfortable as the first time. A very long time ago, he started, some proto-human, some long-forgotten ancestor of mine, probably tried to tell you that this day would come. And it has. They're not lying about that. They've got aging all figured out. Disease. Even got little robots in their blood that put them back together if they get blown up. Oh. But you opted out of all that. I opted out of all that. He agreed with a nod. I chose this. I chose it knowing that one day it would kill me. That it would bring you running. And I had a good run. But now here I am, arguably the most important human being to have ever lived. The last human to die. Holding court with death himself. I shook my head. I will be waiting. I said. One day your machines will fail you. Your technology will fizzle out. Even time itself has to one day come to an end. And when it does I will be waiting. He smiled. You'll be waiting. He said. And so will we. Do we have an accord? The voice intoned from the walls. Wordlessly I nodded my agreement. Lifting my scythe I cut a piece of fabric from my cloak, laying it gently on the corner of the bed. They would know what to do with it. Them and their machines. Very well. Instantly I felt 1,000 little hands with their million little fingers release me. And one hand took mine. And with a tug, the last man to die pulled me into the void. I read 2 stories today that inspired me to write the preceding story. The first was The First Human Death by U. Amphicolius. The second was an unofficial follow-up, titled Inevitable, by U. Sandtrout. I am in no way affiliated with either of the authors, aside from reading their work and being inspired by it. This is my first time posting here, so if I have done something I shouldn't have then I apologize in advance. Author's name and the link to original text in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. And please join our channel.